Hey, Alex.
Good to see you. It's been a long time ago since we saw each other face to face. So, shall I give you the floor, Antonio?
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Alex, for the introduction. And thank you for having me remotely. I hope you're having a really good time in Bangkok. All right, so I'll take it away. This is the disclosure, so no conflict of interest and government funding coming from these sources. And so today I'm going to be talking in the first part of the talk about how we can refine and improve the assessment of cognitive mechanisms. And in the second part of the talk, I'm going to be talking about a trial that we have just finished testing a novel cognitive remediation intervention for methamphetamine use disorder. And the framework that anchors both our assessment efforts and our intervention efforts is this systems neuroscience model that Alex was referring to. So by now, there is consensus that addiction and substance use disorders in particular, but also behavioral addictive disorders, they result from the interaction between different altered systems, and those systems include the incentive salience, negative emotionality, and the ones that I'm going to be focusing on today, which are the executive functions and decision making. So those alterations are observable at the brain level, at the brain systems level, and they also observable at the behavioral level and at the cognitive level. And one of the manifestations of those alterations is what we call impulsivity. So impulsivity is interestingly one of the most frequently cited criteria in DSM-5. And since it is linked to a number of different disorders, some of which are really debilitating, it can be considered a leading cause of morbidity and mortality. The audience will be very familiar with the fact that it's a key diagnostic criterion for substance use disorders, ADHD or bipolar. But one of the interesting things about impulsivity is that it's what we call a multifaceted construct. What that means is that you can have the same output, but that output is driven by different mechanisms. An impulsive behavior can be driven by different mechanisms in different people and in different moments. And that has been a challenge for research, has been a challenge for assessment. And actually one of the problems that we have found is that most of the cognitive measures that have been traditionally used to assess impulsivity, they have been subjected to very limited psychometric scrutiny. The result of that is that a lot of the measures that are conventionally used, they are not really fit for purpose. They reflect a little bit of cherry picking that we do based on availability or based on preference for one task or the other. But the reality is that those tasks have very different origins, very different measure very different aspects of impulse control, and they are not mechanisms-based. One of the consequences of that is that they have limited sensitivity to individual differences. Because substance use and behavioral addictive disorders are highly heterogeneous, this is a real problem because we cannot discriminate like when different aspects of impulsivity are a problem for some of our clients or patients and when they are not. And the other big issue that we noticed is that a lot of the measures of impulsivity, they lack sensitivity to intra-individual changes. So you know that addictive disorders are highly dynamic, and that means that depending on the state of the individual, impulsivity is going to be or is not going to be an issue at that point in time. And at the same time, it's going to be modulated by a number of motivational and affective elements. So if we don't have a measure that is sensitive to change, we're going to have trouble trying to identify the state of the individual, and the measures of impulsivity are going to have limited usability as outcome measures for clinical trials because they're not going to be sensitive to change. So because of these issues, like in the last 5 years, we embarked into this big project to try to develop a unified online battery for cognitive impulsivity. And the guiding principle is that since previous efforts had a limitation in terms of the psychometric scrutiny that had been conducted, we wanted, in this case, to do something that was substantially different to what has been done before. And I guess one of the problems is when you want to test a new measure psychometrically, you need large numbers. By nature, clinical research typically doesn't have access to those large numbers. So what we decided was to design something that could be applied remotely, that people could do from their homes. And of course, like in that way, we could access more people and eventually reach the type of power that we needed to do sophisticated modeling and being able to analyze in very fine detail the psychometric properties. Why that is important, like looking at this plot, it probably looks very boring, but I think the good thing that we took out of that exercise is the ability to clearly differentiate different aspects of impulsive behavior or different mechanisms. So we discovered that impulsivity can be explained by 3 different cognitive mechanisms. One is a problem with attentional control, and that means that you can do impulsive things because of attentional slips. The second one relates to information gathering, and that means that you can do impulsive things when you don't collect sufficient information before making a decision. And the third one has to do with monitoring feedback. So when you do impulsive things after getting some rewards or after being exposed to a loss that make you being impulsive to try kind of regain your wins. And one of the first things that we had to test, of course, is that there were no differences between the online administration and the face-to-face administration. And you can see here in this table the comparison between a face-to-face sample that was collected in the lab using traditional methods versus the online sample. And you can see that there were not significant differences between the two. So that kind of reinforced the idea that we had developed something that could be administered remotely with all the advantages that has, but at the same time had the same level of precision than laboratory measures. And the other thing that we were interested in is what are the psychometric properties. So remember that I mentioned 2 important problems from previous measures. One was difficulty to capture individual differences, and the second was difficulty to capture intra-individual variability, so how people change across time, and whether that change is meaningful, so it really reflects that the person has changed rather than the measure is generating a lot of error. And you can see here that for all the different indices from the battery, we could mostly explain them based on significant between subjects variance. So this is sensitivity to individual differences and also within subjects variance. So this was very positive, but then of course we had to show that these mechanisms were relevant to addiction. So for that we tried to replicate the original structure of the battery in 2 different samples. The first one was a community sample of over 1,000 people. And we replicated the 3-factor structure. And what we observed is that it was particularly the monitoring shifting component, so the impulsivity that results from positive and negative feedback, that was particularly connected with addiction problems in this community sample. And then we moved to a clinical sample, and I guess the advantage is that because we had an online battery that could be administered remotely, we could interact with online treatment services, which are very popular and necessary in Australia, given the geographical dispersion and the limited access from remote areas to treatment services. So we did a partnership with the main provider of online treatment in Australia, which is Turning Point, one of our main collaborators, and we had access to a sample of 578 people. And again, replicated the 3-factor structure. But in this case, it was interesting because in the clinical sample, what we observed is that the mechanism that was more connected with severity of substance use problems was the information gathering. So it was that tendency to collect less information before making a decision that was really linked to the severity of addiction problems in the clinical sample. So what is the advantage of doing things this way? So this is the paradigm of discovery that we developed as part of the efforts of the Neuroscience Interest Group of the International Society of Addiction Medicine. So this was a consensus that we published in 2019 with Hamed, Alex, and other colleagues. And the hope is that by identifying these mechanistic targets through cognitive assessment, we can then develop cognitive interventions that can directly address those mechanisms. And then hopefully through that, we can modify those mechanisms and improve the clinical outcomes for people with substance use disorders. So that's what we tried to do. And now I'm going to move gears to the second part of the talk. With this new cognitive remediation intervention to try to manage impulse control and goal-based decision-making. So this is an intervention that is called goal management training. And it was originally developed for people with brain injury, and it has a very strong evidence base for different populations with neurological disorders. But we had to do a number of adaptations to make it relevant for people with methamphetamine use disorder. So what we did is we embarked in a participatory or co-design process together with people with methamphetamine use problems and their clinicians, and we came up with a revamped, repackaged intervention that was much more catered to their needs, while maintaining the active mechanisms of the original intervention. So let's say the active principles of the interventions can be are summarized here. So it has 4 different modules, the first of which trains awareness and attention, the second one inhibitory control or impulse control, the third one the ability to envision and act on goals, and the fourth one the ability to make decisions considering the consequences that those decisions have. And after we developed the intervention, we moved on to try to test it in a trial, and these are some of the characteristics of the trial design. This was a relatively small proof of concept trial, so the numbers are not big, but the purpose was to have early evidence on whether the intervention was useful to then inform a larger trial. So it was a 4-week single-blind, cluster-randomized crossover trial in therapeutic communities. So these are residential treatments for people with substance use problems. And we had a comparison between our intervention and an active control. And the active control is a psychoeducation focused on brain health. The primary outcomes were the acceptability of the interventions, so whether the interventions were well tolerated and liked by the participants, and also self-reported executive function that was measured with the BRIEF, which is the behavior rating inventory for executive function. And then we had a number of secondary outcomes that were really relevant for us as well. One of them were the cognitive tasks of executive function and impulse control, so including the CIS, which was the online battery that I was presenting before, and clinical measures of dependence, craving, and quality of life. Participants needed to have a diagnosis of methamphetamine use disorder, and they were excluded only if they had a primary diagnosis of psychosis, or schizophrenia, or severe cognitive impairment, or were currently taking benzodiazepines. This is the program. I'm happy to give more details if you're interested, but essentially 4 modules doing cognitive remediation of different aspects of executive function, and this was the comparator. Was a psychoeducation intervention including modules about cognitive deficits and neuroplasticity, physical activity, eating, and sleep. And this is the overall design with the 2 arms. Each of the arms had the same, like the 2 treatments were matched in terms of exposure, time, journal activities. So they were very similar with the exception of the active ingredients. And here you have a little bit of a summary of the outcome measures, but because this is a busy table, I will summarize like you had the BRIEF, which is the self-report assessment of executive functions, and then cognitive measures, and then clinical measures of craving, dependence, and quality of life. Participants' characteristics, like they probably sound very familiar. So we had people in their mid-30s with secondary education, high severity of dependence, and a number of mental health comorbidities. So representative of treatment-seeking populations. And in terms of the results, for acceptability, so in terms of people liking the interventions, we had really good indicators. So no participants withdrew from the interventions after consenting, and over 70% of the individuals completed 3 or more sessions out of the 4. We also rated the within-session engagement, and it was pretty good. It was 37 in a scale of 0 to 40 for GMT and 36 for brain health. In terms of benefits, I guess the most important thing is that we didn't have significant effects on the primary outcome measure, so no effects on self-reported executive function. The 2 interventions look the same. But on the other hand, when we moved into objective measures of executive function and impulse control, we had large effects of the active intervention on reducing impulsivity, and particularly some of the aspects of impulsivity that are really connected with substance use-related problems, information gathering and discounting. We also had a large and significant effect on severity of dependence, so the intervention was superior to the control in reducing severity of dependent symptoms, and no effects on craving or quality of life. So, in conclusion, I think one of the important messages is that you can innovate in the intervention space, and you can link mechanistic interventions into mainstream services. So this is not easy to do, but I think you can do it through the little steps that we were giving: the co-design, participation, and then integration into existing services. Unfortunately, we didn't have effects on the main outcome measure, and we think is because the active intervention goal management training was kind of making people a little bit more aware of their problems, and that probably diluted the effect on the self-control executive functions that we had expected large positive effects on objective cognitive indices and dependent symptoms. So this gives you an idea of how we are trying to innovate using a mechanism-sensitive approach, and how we're trying to address those mechanisms through cognitive remediation and improving clinical outcomes through that. And that's it. Thank you very much, and thank you to everyone that funded us and to all of our collaborators, especially my students, Alex Anderson and Alex Robinson. Yeah, that's it from me.